So, the next period that we're going to be discussing in the art of the ancient Greeks is a period in history called the Archaic. Now, Archaic Greek art refers to a time frame between about 600 and exactly 480 BCE. That first number is approximate, about 600 roughly, in terms of when this style occurs, but 480 is a very specific number. And this is because there's a very important event that takes place in 480 BC, which we'll be talking about a little bit later as we move on and look at some other examples of work. But first off, let's talk a little bit about what we can expect to see when we look at Greek examples from this archaic period. The Greek archaic period, again, like the Orientalizing period before it, shows the influence of the Near East, of Egypt. But there's some very specific conventions we see that become rather firmly rooted during this period. One of these is the use of something called the archaic smile. And this is actually kind of a little unusual. When we look at these Greek statues from the period, they all have this kind of almost goofy smile. Very broad grin across their face. And while in truth it doesn't occur on every statue, it is a very common convention. And in many cases, we'll see that this smile seems completely out of place. You may have a character, an individual, who has an arrow sticking out of them, dying, and they still have this big, goofy grin. This smile, this strange-looking archaic smile, is in fact not intended to be an expression of happiness or an emotional state, but rather is a conveyance of the concept that this individual is alive. And so this is kind of why it's included. And some of the situations where we don't see it is in funerary statuary, which of course makes sense when you think about it in those terms. But we do see some, again, combinations of things such as stylized and abstract patterning with naturalism. For example, we'll see very stylized hair, geometric patterns within those, within hair again as well. Also, just proportions and the shape of the body here is also really quite stylized and less than accurate in terms of proportion and shape, as you'll see when we look at some examples. Later in the period, of course, this is refined. And it isn't really a black and white transition, to be honest, from geometric to orientalizing to archaic to classical. What we see is a continuum, this consistent and ongoing change and evolution. But we do tend to still try to break these down into manageable parts and dates, which again, by the way, is why 480 becomes an important date. And we'll talk about that when we get a little farther along. So looking at this example here, this is an example of a type of object, a type of statue, which we call a koros. So a koros is these idealized young men, these statuary forms. There are male forms and female forms. The male forms, again, are called koros. The females are kore, or plural korai. Now, one of the significant differences you'll notice, by the way, is that female statues, the kore, are always clothed. They always have clothing on. Whereas the men, the koros, are always nude. And that's just standard. The one we're looking at here is located in New York, and conveniently, it's often referred to as the New York koros. It's larger than life size. It's about 6.5 feet tall, carved out of marble. And again, shows us this idealized young man. Statues like this probably functioned as memorials or grave markers, but one significant difference when compared to, for example, Egyptian, similar statues, is that these were not intended as repository for the soul. These are not Ka statues. If we look here at a comparison between one of these Koros figures, again, the New York Koros, and compare that with an example that's roughly contemporaneous from ancient Egypt, you'll see these only are about 50 years apart. The one on the right, again, much more associated with these Egyptian concepts of permanence, of longevity, with their funerary traditions, whereas the Koros figure on the left, dating to about 600, is in fact really intended to be simply more of a marker or a memorial. So we see some similarities here, by the way, in terms of the rigidity of the form still. Look at the tightness of the arms, the fists on the sides. You can definitely see the Greek debt to Egyptian style and art in this particular example. But here's a key difference. If you look carefully, if you look at the right and look at Mentehemet, and you'll see that there's this block of stone between his legs, a solid pillar. Now compare that to what you see in the New York Koros. It's been freed from the stone. And this is a significant difference. This is something that we see happen as one of the early departures by the Greeks from the other styles which they witnessed and absorbed, really, into their own art forms. So another really particularly interesting one we can look at here is called the calf bearer. We know that we know the patron of this. It was dedicated by a man named Rhombos. It was placed on the Acropolis in ancient Greece, created about 560 BCE. And its restored height, it's about life size, probably 5 foot 5 inches in height. And here we can very clearly see this goofy kind of archaic smile and the very stylized hair as this man carries a calf, which was probably intended to be an offering to the gods. So another name for this, because this is a fairly standard posture, if you will, this idea of carrying a calf, enough so that we call these moschophoros, calf bearers. And this piece was found fragmentary, broken, found at the Acropolis, and then later reassembled. And this particular example is, one of several examples that were discovered buried at the Acropolis. And this comes really into what we're talking about later, of course, with the end of the Archaic period. Something rather tremendous happens, rather awful for the Greeks, in 480 BCE, and as a result, we have many examples of these archaic works, statuary such as this, that have been found at the site of the Acropolis in Athens. The Persians invaded and laid siege and sacked and destroyed the Acropolis and the temples of the Acropolis. And so the Greeks originally intended just to leave this as a memorial, really, and all of the statuary was buried. And later during the classical period, when Pericles goes about the process of reconstructing, rebuilding the Acropolis, much of this is still there and it just covered over. And so, more recent archaeological digs and excavations at the site have uncovered some of these earlier archaic works. Another thing that's interesting about this particular example is the garment that this moschophoros, more than likely again representing Rhombos here, is wearing. A little bit like what we saw when we looked at that example of Menkaure and Khmer Nebti and other Egyptian examples, we see a form of clothing that doesn't really exist. But it's intended to try to show some semblance of decency, and that this is not a guy who would be running around naked in public because he's probably an important person. And yet it's still intended to be thin and sheer and exemplify those ideals of Greek musculature and anatomy and structure and show perfection of the body. And so it's a compromise, really, a way to both show his physical prowess and also show his financial wealth. So the example we're looking at here, this is, in fact, Croesus, and he is from Anavistos in Greece, dating to about 530 BCE. Again, carved from marble, larger than life size, about 6'4", and located today in Athens in the Archaeological Museum. This was originally painted using beeswax mixed with a series of different colorants. And this process is called encaustic, this painting with hot wax. And it's a very, very permanent process. And even though this statue is obviously, several thousand years old, we still see elements of color that remain. And this is really pretty astonishing. You can see it primarily in the hair more than any place else. People today tend to think of Greek statues as being, gleaming white marble or bronze, of course, although not as many of those remain. But one of the things that people don't tend to realize is that the majority, really, of these statues were often quite brightly painted. And in most cases, the paint doesn't really remain. But in some cases, like we see here, some part of this is still visible. Another key thing we'll look at here, we're going to take a moment here and kind of compare and contrast a little bit. So the statue that we're looking at here, and then in the next slide, you'll see it compared with an earlier example of a Koros statue. You'll notice that the difference between these two is really quite striking in terms of the anatomy, the structure, and the way that the artisan here has really expressed human anatomy. So in both cases, we don't really see an example that's probably a realistic representation of an individual person. These are not really a specific likeness. It's more of a representation of an idealized individual. But on the left-hand side, in this earlier version, we can see how close this is to the Egyptian canon, for example. But on the right-hand side, with the Anavisos Koros, we can see that the body is rendered in a much more naturalistic manner. We look at the musculature, particularly at the ribs, at the pelvis. We can see that it is rendered in a much more realistic way. You can also see this when we take a look at the size of the head. On the left-hand side, the head is really quite oversized for the body. On the right, the face is more rounded, and even the hair falls in a more naturalistic manner. The hips here are more round rather than triangular, and so we can here begin to see the Greeks move towards a much greater sense of naturalism, of observation of the human form, rather than simply following a very formulaic canon, as we see in earlier examples, and also oftentimes when we take a look at ancient Egyptian work. So the statue that we're looking at here is an example of a kore, and again, a koros is a male figure, and they're always nude, and a kore is a female figure, and they are never nude. This one dates to about 530 BCE, made of marble, again, and about 4 feet in height, and like these other examples, this also comes from the Acropolis Museum. This one is quite similar stylistically to the Anavisos Koros. In this case, she's wearing something known as a peplos. This is a very simple belted woolen garment, and also kind of important when we talk about the Acropolis and Athena, because there was a famous wooden statue of Athena, which every year during the Panathenaic festival would be dressed in a new woolen peplos. This was part of again, an important series of ceremonial processes that took place in ancient Athens. This statue was buried for about 2,000 years, as was the Moschophoros, the calf bearer, and then rediscovered later. These were among the statues that were broken and knocked down, toppled by the Persians when they sacked the Acropolis in 480 BCE. And so this is one of the reasons why these are as well preserved as they were, because they were buried on site. In this case, this woman's left arm is broken off, but probably held an item there that would have given us a much greater sense of who she was. It could have been something that identified her as a maiden, as a goddess, or maybe even possibly Athena herself. We don't really know. But again, when we look at this stylistically speaking, especially comparing it back to earlier examples, like perhaps the Lady of Auxerre, we can see how it is much more realistic. It's still quite stylized, however. For example, if you take a look at the lower half of this statue, you can almost envision a column rather than a real person. We don't get a sense of real anatomy and structure and physiology beneath the garment, beneath this peplos. But that's something to watch for, because we will be seeing that as we move along. So this is another example of a kore, also from the Acropolis. This one's a little bit later than the previous example. And rather than wearing a peplos, this woman is wearing something called a himation and a chiton. And so the himation is a mantle which drapes over a lighter cotton chiton. And this is kind of what I think most people tend to think of when they envision traditional Greek garb. This particular example also really has quite a bit of the surviving encaustic paint. And so is a great example to see, again, both the contrast in the fabric, the development of the style, and also some of the surviving paint on one of these early Greek examples. So let's talk a little bit about architecture during the Archaic period, and really Greek architecture in general. So when we talk about Greek architecture, one of the things that a lot of people don't always realize is that these orders, the Ionic, the Doric, the Corinthian, are not really chronological developments, they're actually geographic. Particularly the Ionic and the Doric are specific geographic regions we'll be looking at. The Ionic culture centers on coastal Greece and Turkey, whereas Doric culture is mainland Greece. The Corinthian style is a later development, but this is something that kind of evolves out of the Ionic and specifically takes on an acanthus leaf decoration, and we'll take a look at that as we move on. The Ionic eventually evolves into a style that is considered to be the feminine, whereas the Doric is the masculine in some cases, and the Ionic is often used as an internal order. whereas Doric is external or exterior. And this is something that we see develop a little later in the High Classical, and we also see this used in some specific examples like, well, the Parthenon. We see this specific combination of Doric exterior and an Ionic interior. So what we're looking at here is an example of a plan view. And in this plan view, one of the things that we can see are some of the key vocabulary and key concepts that really relate with the format, really, of the traditional Greek temple. So some of the key things that we'll mention here, the central sanctuary in the middle here, kind of the Holy of Holies, if you will, where the cult statue was kept, is called the Naos. And it's important to note that the primary function, the primary purpose of a Greek temple is to hold that cult statue. That's what it's really for. Now, on the front side of that, which is accessed from the exterior, and then is how you have to go through in order to enter the naos, is something called the pronaos. So the pronaos comes before the naos. This is kind of a vestibule or entryway. Now, interestingly, these are often counterposed on the backside by something called an opisthedomos. And believe it or not, the primary function of the opisthedomos here is often to provide a visual balance to the pronaos. In some cases, like for example the Parthenon, we see this used functionally as a treasury, but in many cases it is in fact strictly a aesthetic development. We also have a series of side passages, or pteroma. We have, of course, our colonnades, which surround this, and some other key concepts. The peristyle is the full perimeter of columns. The columns, by the way, on the sides are called pteron, or flank columns. One of the other concepts that we'll be looking at here are what are called the columns in antis. So the anti are the walls, essentially. The ends of the walls there on either side of the naos, the cella, the sanctuary within the colonnade. And the columns in antis are the columns which are framed by those anti on either side. Another key concept here too, the steps on the exterior of the platform of this structure. We have what's called the stereobate and the stylobate. So the stereobate are the outer stairs that work their way upward. And often we have a couple of these, sometimes we have many when we look at some examples, like for example the Temple of Apollo at Didyma. But then the very top level is the stylobate. So all the columns, the naos, those rest atop the stylobate. So in addition to the things we see in the plan view, we also have some important concepts and terminology that we look at with the elevation view. So this is an example of the Doric elevation. So all of these elevations, whether it's the Doric or the Ionic, are broken down to a couple of major categories. So we have the entablature, and that's actually what we're looking at here. The entablature is really all of the stuff on top of the columns. Below that we have the columns themselves, and then below that we have the stereobate and stylobate. But when we take a look here at the entablature, this can be further broken down. We have the architrave, the frieze, and then above that we have the cima or the cornice. And so within these, again, we can further break these down. The architrave basically is the beam which rests on top of the columns and supports all of the stuff up above. The frieze breaks down a little bit depending upon which order we're looking at. Here in the Doric order, the frieze is broken down into a series of alternating metopes and triglyphs. So the metopes are actually areas of sculptural decoration. And what you can kind of see referenced here is an example from the Battle of Lapiths and Centaurs. These were sculptural panels which fitted in between these vertical bars. And these probably referenced what these structures looked like before they were made of stone. When they were made of wood, these would have been wooden beams. And these triglyphs, a series of 3 vertical designs, separate the metopes. And again, reference where there probably would have been originally wooden members. Above this, on top, again, we have the cornice, which is composed of the raking cornice or raking cima, the Jasen, and several other elements. But we don't need to belabor all of these. The main thing, really, for this course is that you are familiar with the major components, really, of the entablature, including the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice. Looking here at the at an Ionic example, we can once again see some of the same pieces. We have the architrave below. These look a little different in the Ionic period. They have this three-level design that we can see stepping outward. The frieze in the Ionic period is also quite different. Generally, the frieze on an Ionic structure is a continuous band of narrative or sculptural decoration, rather than a series of metopes alternating with triglyphs. And then finally, in the top here, we can see the cornice. And these can vary quite a bit. Sometimes with the Ionic style, these may be flat, particularly if it's an example of a temple that's open to the sky, like the Apollo temple at Didyma, or it may also sometimes include a raking cornice or cyma. But again, this kind of depends upon the example that we're looking at. So when we talk about archaic architecture specifically, Greek archaic architecture, this early stuff in particular, the really early examples, are typified by really fairly massive and heavy architecture. And we can see an example of this here of the Temple of Hera I, also sometimes referred to as the Basilica at Paestum. And ironically, this is, the site, Paestum, is one of the best places we can go to see examples of early Greek architecture. But it's not in Greece. This is in Italy. And this is because some of these best surviving Greek temples are, not on the Greek mainland. But Hera I, again, sometimes referred to as the Basilica, which is a Roman word, by the way, is an example of what some of this early Doric architecture looks like. So this is a pro-style temple, which means that it's surrounded by a continuous colonnade on all sides. And this is, again, Doric. But when we look at the capitals here, if we look closely, and you can see these in this next example, when we look at the capitals of these Doric columns, we can see that they tend to be really quite flattened. There's two parts to the capital that we see here. First, the echinus, which is the kind of pancake-looking structure we see, and then above that, the abacus. And in this early example, they're really quite wide, quite flattened, and they give the impression, really, that they're under tremendous weight. And this is something that will kind of shift and develop as we look at later examples. The Temple of Hera I is really a fairly massive example. This temple is quite large in terms of scale. It's 180 by 70 feet. And it does maintain its entire original peripteral colonnade, which is quite remarkable. It's a little odd in terms of design, though. Because this is an early example, there are some decisions made in terms of the way that it's created, which were probably not quite optimal. One of these is the fact that it has 9 columns across the front face. We can see that here in this plan view. And as a result, one of the things that ends up happening is that we have a row of columns that run right down the middle of the temple. Now keep in mind that a temple like this would be intended for a cult statue. And so when you have a colonnade running down the middle of the temple, that makes it a little awkward in terms of the placement of a specific individual cult statue. And so this is solved to some extent in terms of the design. You can see here with the final end of the sanctuary, the naos at the far end, being accessed by 2 individual doors. But this is less than ideal. And so in later examples, we're going to see that the Greeks make some modifications and make some design improvements on this style of temple. So the example we just looked at, the Temple of Hera I, while the colonnade survives, none of its sculptural ensemble, none of its friezes or any of its pedimental statuary survive. It's all gone. But we can look at some other examples that may give us some idea of what the pedimental statuary may have looked like. So the pediment is a triangular area which is created on the front and the back of the temple as a result of having this raking angled cornice. And these are traditionally some of the most interesting places to look at Greek statuary. The example we're looking at here is relatively contemporaneous with the Temple of Hera I at Paestum. This is from Corfu in Greece, from the Temple of Artemis. And what we see here is actually one of the Gorgons. This is Medusa. And she's got this tremendous pinwheeling sense of motion going on here. We can see her kind of spinning. We can also see the snake belt. We can see the serpents in her hair. On either side, she's flanked by these panther-like figures, which are a little bit reminiscent of some of the art we've seen in the ancient Near East. She also was originally accompanied here by 2 of her children, by Chrysaor and also on the right by Pegasus. Only the legs, really, of Pegasus remain, on her right, that is, rather. And we can see a little bit more surviving of Chrysaor over on her left, or our right. But this is an interesting example, and it's also quite large. It's about 9'4" in height when we're talking about Medusa. We can also see how she begins to break out of that register, which is also really quite interesting. In this example here, this next image, we can see a little bit better detail of her. And you can see some of the musculature. You can see just the intensity of this figure. Very, very powerful rendition here of this kind of horrific creature, the Gorgon. So, one of the best examples of archaic friezes that we can look at comes to us from the frieze of the treasury of the Siphnians from Delphi. So Delphi was an important place in the ancient Greek world. It was a place where there was an oracle. And because this was such an important place in terms of religion to the ancient Greeks, many Greek city-states held a treasury at the site. And these treasuries were places where the citizens of those individual city-states could have services in terms of storing their goods, and they also served as repositories for wealth. But the treasury of the Siphnians is one of the best known of these early examples, and it's a fairly small temple. We'll take a look at a drawing of the exterior in a moment, but first, if we take a look here at some examples of the frieze that surrounded this, they're really pretty striking. What we're looking at here is a very famous Greek scene. There's a couple of kind of key scenes that we see over and over again. These include Centauromachi, which is the battle of Lapiths and Centaurs, the Amazonomachi, which is the battle with the Amazons, and then, of course, what we see here, Gigantomachy, the battle of gods and giants. And in this particular image, we can see these lions attaching and biting onto the giants. We can see up there on the right-hand side, Apollo and Artemis pursuing a giant. And so this incredible scene of battle and chaos going on in this Ionic frieze. In the next image here, we can see a little farther over the right-hand side, you can see one of the giants fallen, others arraying their shields to defend themselves against these gods. And in the middle here, you can also see still a hint of color. Again, people don't tend to realize that these friezes were brightly painted, often in reds and blues and yellows, and we don't really expect to see that, but that's how they would have originally appeared. So this is the exterior, or at least a reconstruction drawing of the exterior of the treasury of the Siphnians from Delphi. And this is a fairly small temple, as you can see here. This is what we would call a pro-style temple, in that it doesn't have any columns on either side, just the columns on the front. And in this case, the columns are caryatids. They're columns which are formed in the shape of women. And we'll see some other examples of these at a very famous example when we talk about the Erechtheion and look at classical Greek architecture. So from here, let's take a moment and talk a little bit about Greek painting again. We visited this topic briefly when we looked at the geometric period and also at the Orientalizing period. But during the Archaic, Greek painting develops pretty impressively, and we see the use of some rather amazing techniques and processes. There's a couple major schools or major categories really that we look at when it comes to Greek painting during this period in history. The first of these is what we call black figure painting. Black figure painting is created by throwing a vessel or creating a vessel using a reddish colored clay body. And then this is painted over with a black slip. So a slip is a colored liquefied clay. And this can be painted over in a surface and then burnished and polished. And then by scratching or incising, cutting through this black slip, the reddish orange color of the clay below is revealed. Now you can also just not paint large areas, of course, and some combination of that process is used in many of the examples that we see. But Greek black figure painting is probably best exemplified by this work here that we're looking at. This is an example of a Greek amphora, which was found in Volchi in Italy. Many, by the way, famous Greek artworks were found in Italy. The later Etruscans and also the Romans were huge importers of Greek work. And so we find examples of famous Greek work, oftentimes within the tombs of the Etruscans or in Roman context, because they valued the pottery and the artwork of these individuals so much. But what we're looking at here is two heroes from the Trojan War, represented here by a famous Greek artist named Ezekias. And he did, in fact, sign this, so we know this was done by Ezekias. Oftentimes, Greek artisans would sign their work, and sometimes we have two names. You may have a potter and a painter, sometimes only the painter. Sometimes the same artisan did both. But in this case, we know that this particular work was created by Ezekias in terms of both. He was the potter, the creator of the object, and the painter. And that's pretty remarkable. So he didn't use traditional registers. He does these very large-scale figures instead. And here he represents something kind of interesting. So we're talking about two heroes from the ancient, from the Trojan War. You've got Achilles and Ajax. But rather than showing them in the midst of battle, he shows them playing dice. They're here relaxing, kind of trying to waste time in between the terrors of battles that may be coming. They're just taking up some time here, throwing the dice around and trying to relax and have a little bit of time for themselves in between battles. So that's pretty remarkable. Also in terms of its handling, in terms of its artistry, its skill, it is a really tremendous object. If we look at the detail here, you can see just how fine the lines, the stylized decorative motifs that are used here as well really convey a tremendous sense of artistry and craftsmanship. So this black figure style of pottery is really quite popular, and we see this continue for some time. But eventually we see a few people innovate a new technique. And the new technique is kind of the reverse. Rather than painting black figures onto a red background and carving details, some artisans begin to figure out that they can paint the background black and leave the figures red. And then this allows a much more painterly approach, because they can go in with a paintbrush and paint in the black details rather than carving them through the slip. And the first examples we see of this are something called bilingual pottery. And the example we're looking at here is by the Endocades painter. And it is, you'll notice, a very, very similar example to what we saw a moment ago. So this guy actually copies the work of Ezekias. And this was commonly done, by the way. And this is, again, Achilles and Ajax playing dice once again. And that's pretty standard. We see that on the left. But on the right-hand side, he repeats the image with some fairly significant stylistic changes. And he also renders it, in this case, in red figure. He reverses the colors. And this gives the artist the ability to vary the line weight with a brush. A much more painterly technique is used. And really opens a lot of new possibilities for decoration. This brings us to what we call red figure pottery. And in this case, figures are painted in the negative. We have a black background, red figures, and the details are painted rather than carved or incised into the surface. And again, this is a much more painterly and less linear process for design. The example we see here is by a famous artist by the name of Euphronios. Euphronios here has created a scene representing one of the legends of Heracles, the Greek hero. And here he's shown wrestling Antaios. Antaios was an earth giant. And so whenever he came into contact with the ground, it would renew his strength. And so this was a tremendous battle for Heracles, because he would fight this guy, and as soon as he touched the ground, he'd just spring right back up. So finally Heracles figures out that he has to pick him up into the air and crush him without letting him touch the ground. And that's what he does, and that's how he wins. But rather, again, than show Heracles in that moment of triumph, here the artist Euphronios shows him at this moment of struggle, where he's wrestling on the ground with Antaios, and he hasn't quite figured out how to beat him yet. And we have this tremendous battle going on between these two monumental warriors. Antaios is shown, though, here in pain. His teeth are bared, his hair is unkempt, his right arm is hanging limp as he battles with Heracles. This, again, is also found in Italy. This is from Cerveteri, which was an Etruscan site, an necropolis. So this was a grave good. And again, this shows the value that these other societies placed on Greek art, even at this early date. Another thing about this particular example that's quite revolutionary is that the figures are not placed in these very simple, separate, disparate, individualized spaces. They're overlapping each other. We have this real sense of three-dimensional space in the way that the figures are interacting with each other. And that's pretty revolutionary for this period in history. Another very famous work. This is by Euthymides, and it's called Three Revelers, another painted red figure amphora, and again, also from Volchi, Italy. So this guy was actually a contemporary of Euphronios and one of his rivals, and in fact, he signed this particular work in a rather interesting manner. It actually says, "Euthymides painted me, as Euphronios never could do." So a final example that we'll look at here of red figure painting. And this is by an artist that we know today as the Niobid painter. And we call this artist the Niobid painter because we don't actually know their name. They didn't sign their work. But in many cases we can attribute the work of a series of vessels like this to a given artist based upon their style. And so this artist we call the Niobid painter based upon the subject of this work. And they've been able to recognize other examples by this painter based upon their technique. So this example here shows Artemis and Apollo, and they are essentially, well, they're kind of settling a grudge. There was a woman named Niobe, and she had boasted that she was superior to the goddess Leto because she had had at least a dozen children. And of course, well, Leto wasn't too happy about this. So Leto sent her two children, which were Artemis and Apollo, to massacre the children of Niobe to punish her for her arrogance. Sort of a, well, now you don't have any children. That was really kind of her way of dealing with that slight. So we have this image of slaughter, and it occurs in a rather interesting kind of schematic landscape. We have rocks and trees, figures represented on several levels. And while it doesn't represent a really accurate and convincing depiction of space, it really is an important step in the direction of representing landscape, as well as simply figures in a composition. So back to architecture, we're going to talk about a really important example here. The transition between the Archaic period and the Classical period has an object that we can focus on that gives us a really tremendous idea of really how these two periods are different. So what we're looking at here is a temple. This is a temple of Apphia at Aegina. And the Temple of Apphia was built between 500 and 490 BCE. And so as you can see, that's just shortly before the beginnings of the Classical period. Well, this was an interesting period in history. So we have this beautiful temple built, and it's done in the Doric style in this late Archaic period. And it's a well-balanced temple. It's the colonnade is 45 feet by 95 feet. We have 6 Doric columns on one side, 12 on the other, along the long side. Much less ungainly than what we see, for example, at the Temple of Hera I at Paestum. We have a greater sense of space. The columns are much more proportional and more slender. We also had a double row of columns, a double story of columns down the middle, which would raise the height of the cella. So again, really a pretty striking innovation. But what we really want to look at, what we really want to talk about when we look at this example, is when we look here at the pediment. So this is the west pediment from the Temple of Apphia, and the statuary on this pediment was created between 500 and 490 BCE, and we can see Athena standing in the middle with these other figures flanking her, and in particular I want you to pay attention to the figure on the far right. There's a warrior crouched down there. He's in the far corner of the pediment, and we're going to be taking a much closer look at him in a moment. Before we do that, though, here's another view of Athena, and you can see we again have this typical archaic smile, really quite stylized in terms of the form, but again, this again striking image of the goddess. So here we have that warrior that I mentioned from the far right corner. And so this is a dying warrior. One of the things you have to realize about this guy is that hand that you see would have been grasping a bronze arrow that no longer survives. So this is a guy who had been shot in the chest with an arrow. So he's on his way out. He's dying. And when we look at his face, we still see this kind of goofy, archaic smile. And while certain features here, the feet, the hands, are rendered in a very realistic manner, take a look at the pose. If you've just been shot with a bow, are you going to have your legs crossed and sitting up in this manner? It's this very kind of uncomfortable, twisted, very frontal, very rigid pose. And while this is appropriate for the Archaic period and it's intended to kind of converse with the audience, it's not entirely accurate, not entirely realistic. So these are some of the things that are typical of the Archaic. We have this rigid frontality. We have this direct interaction with the audience. We have this archaic smile. When we move on to the Classical period here very shortly, you're going to see how these change, how these differ, because it's really pretty amazing. We'll be looking at, in our next lecture, the statuary, the sculptural works from the other side of the same temple, which were made to replace a series that had been broken. So the time period between the two set of statuary groups is minimal. They're really close together. But in terms of their style, they are a generation apart. And we're going to see how these differ again in the next lecture.